You know, Mike Bloomberg has a great quote, and the quote is, "While nations talk, cities act." And Mike has that one-liner, but this fellow, Ben Barber, has written the book. And I mentioned it this morning. I remember when Ben told me about the book a couple of years ago when he was just starting in on it, and he told me the title. I think it's the best title of a book I've heard in a long time, better than any of mine, If Mayors Rule the World. And the reason that book has a great title is Ben and I share a lot of things in common. We care about globalization. Well, Ben's essay on Jihad and McWorld that was published in The Atlantic, one of the classic and best essays I've ever read. So we share interest in writing for The Atlantic. We also share an editor, the amazing Bill Frucht, who's great at titles. He came up with The Rise of the Creative Class. I'm not sure he came up with The Mayors Rule the World. We share an editor. Ben is somebody I've long admired. He's one of the most important international political scientists in the world. He's contributed to books on political theory, books on globalization, and to see him, to someone of his stature, turn their attention to cities tells us that cities and mayors are really where the action is. Ben has had an incredibly long and distinguished academic career. He's now at the Center for Philanthropy and Civil Society at the Graduate Center of City University of New York, and he was the Walt Whitman Professor of Political Science for a long time at my alma mater, Rutgers University. He's written 17 books. He blogs and writes regularly. You see his stuff in The Atlantic, in the New York Times, on the Huffington Post. And we want to talk about how life would be, something we've been talking about all day, but how life would be better if mayors ruled the world. So Ben, I'll start with a simple question. When did you get the idea? What was the spur? You know, you were writing on Jihad and McWorld. You're writing on globalization. You're writing on nation states. When did you take this turn? And why did you begin to decide that cities were a place you needed to devote your attention and that were important to our society and governance and international affairs?
Well, Richard, first let me say, unlike you, I'm not an urbanist. I'm not someone who's made an extraordinary career thinking creatively about creative cities. I'm a political theorist. I'm a democratic theorist. And I came to this from the point of view of theory. As you say, my work before this was really devoted to thinking about democracy in the United States, democracy in Europe, democracy in a consumer world, democracy in a world of terrorism and global markets. And what really led me to this was the gradual realization that nation states that have been the conservators of our democracy for 400 years were becoming increasingly dysfunctional. Now, I won't try to prove that's a controversial statement, I know, in this country today, to say that the U.S. government is dysfunctional, but take it from me. It is. It's not just that nations talk and cities do things. Nowadays, nations only talk to each other, and we have a kind of deadly silence in Washington. So the dysfunction of nations, both around their own problems and challenges, but also around the challenges of the world, was really what led me to begin to look again at cities. And I think there's a simple thing we sometimes don't say, all of us who are in cities and think about cities, which is that cities, unlike states and nations or the UN, cities are where we're born, where we grow up, we go to school, we play, we pray, we work, we get married, we have children, we go out to the parks, we hold our jobs, we get old, and eventually we die. They're home. You know, we are all home boys and home girls. We're all home people. Cities are about that. So, and the world started with cities. It started with the polis. And for a long time we had empires and monarchies, but we've kind of come back to the reality that cities are not only where we are born and where we are live, but they are the places that can still make democracy work. And Richard, you know that the trust levels right now in government, we were talking about trust in big data and so on, the trust levels in government, it was a couple of weeks ago 14% in the US Congress. It's -3 this morning, I think. The Supreme Court used to have 60, 70%, it's down to 30 or 40. Even the presidency, we have a relatively popular president, but he's around 38, 40%. Mayors and council people are still registering at 65, 70, 75% trust all around the world. They belong to us. They're our neighbors. So it's not, you know, you said at the opening, well, gosh, you know, I finally came to cities. I finally got smart and realized that cities were where it is happening.
Now, you asked a provocative question this morning, a challenging question that I took to heart. And you said, there's a world of cities out there. Many of them are struggling, and particularly cities, large cities. You invoked a great work, Mike Davis's work, Planet of Slums, we talk about the upside of cities, but there's also a downside. Given the research you've done for this book, I hate to turn your own question back on you, Ben, but how do you think we can begin to address the kinds of tensions and contradictions and both the bright side and the dark side of cities? And what have you seen, perhaps, in going around internationally and globally, given your historic work? Where can we start on some of those problems?
Let me give the good news and the bad news. The good news is news that you really helped bring to the world in your work on the creativity and entrepreneurial character of cities that issue out of density, mobility, immigrant populations, and diversity, all of which make an extraordinary creativity in cities that allow them to solve very difficult problems. Someone said this morning, well, what about Detroit? Whenever I say mayors rule the world, cities are doing well, people say, yeah, but what about Detroit? But the reality is, even in Detroit today, the entrepreneurship of people working in the community, the number of young hipsters who are moving into some of the dilapidated housing, the number of new economy jobs that are being created inside Detroit is extraordinary. So in fact, cities are, this term resilient cities, is real. Cities are resilient. That's the good news. Cities have the capacity to deal with disaster, deal with unemployment, deal with inequality. But the bad news is that inequality within and among cities is a product of global forces, global economic forces, global capitalist forces, global market forces, which cities by themselves can't control, not at least one by one. And that's why the other side of this equation, that cities have to not only deal with their own problems, but find ways to collaborate and cooperate globally to begin to bring to bear a global governance structure on issues of global markets, global inequality, global poverty, north-south differences. Without cities working together, states have failed. Cities have to do that not one by one, but together.
And we're going to get there in a second, but you've hit on, it's funny how we grow together. I grow from your work. You're kind enough to say stuff about mine. My own work that I'm working on stems from a realization that the rise of the creative class got it half right. And that realization is that agglomeration forces, clustering forces, innovation forces, density are creating enormous advantage. And side by side to that, in our concentrated advantage, wonderfully renewing cities, we see the highest level of concentrated disadvantage. So this inequality you mentioned, that's going to be my next book. This inequality you mentioned, side by side with great wealth, and right next door, and it's no longer the hole in the donut. The city's all poor and the suburbs are rich. It's a patchwork, it's a quilt, it's a fragmented metropolis. Going back to political theory and your work on governance, how do we grapple with this intellectually? How do we begin, and it's what we've been talking about, how do we create a narrative, and not only a narrative, but a set of pathways that get us out of this box, renewed cities, golded cities, gilded cities, and concentrated disadvantage and the perpetuation of disadvantage side by side?
Well, there was a gentleman this morning from India who was a little frustrated. He said,
yep.
Very pretty what you're saying on the stage, irrelevant to me and the mayors of cities in India and perhaps in China and Indonesia and in Africa as well, where inequality is quadrupled in its impact and character, and where cities are being created from 10,000 to 1 million in 10 years, and where we have cities of 20 and 30 million people, these mega cities and the mega slums to go with them. But what's amazing there's a book I'm sure many of you know by Catherine Boo called Beyond the Beautiful Tomorrows, and that's a book in which she, both with anger and despair, but also a weird kind of optimism, traces what poverty-stricken children who literally farm the dumps to recycle stuff, how that becomes a way out of poverty for some of them, how the informal economy becomes a way of building. We know that the informal economy, squatting, informal jobs, often become a route to a more formal kind of equality. It's been pointed out that 20 million young Egyptians are out of work and have college degrees. That was true under Mubarak, it was true under Morsi, it's still true today, and it's one of the problems. But here's the fact. If those 20 million young Egyptians between 15 and 25 were really totally unemployed and had no income, Egypt would either explode or disappear. The fact is they are keeping jobs in the informal economy, which is keeping Egypt alive. So there are ways forward that rely on the resilience, the mobility, the creativity, and the entrepreneurship. And the people who vote for that formula are the poor people who come to cities who know already they're not going to fall into real good jobs and into an education, but they have a better chance in the city than anywhere else.
I want to push you on this because this man has taught me a lot. When I wrote The World is Spiky, basically influenced by your piece. When I read your piece on Jihad and McWorld, you laid it out. That globalization was creating winners and losers together. And that it was creating the world is flat from the peaks. From the top of the peaks, the world is flat, but from the deep valleys, and it's side by side. You know, London is more connected with Shanghai than the people in the hinterland, so on and so forth. How do we begin to address this? Particularly, we've been talking a lot about the strategies in the advanced world. Even in the Detroits of the world, which have many, many assets, great research universities, design traditions, architecture. How do we begin to grapple with this in these cities which are attracting billions of people in the emerging economies, developing world?
Well, to use a theoretical phrase that has a lot of, I think, impact, the membranes that divide our cities educationally, employment-wise, politically, are permeable. Urban membranes are permeable, and so the sharp divides we think we see between ghetto and non-ghetto, between rich and poor, are far more permeable, exactly for some of the reasons you talk about when you look at the entrepreneurial and creative quality, not of artists and cultural people, but of people who start little businesses, people who figure out ways to turn collecting cans into a business. And that permeability of the membranes of a city is what comprises the mobility of cities and the hope and the optimism of the people who come. Because interestingly, the most optimistic people about poverty in the cities is the poor. Now you might say that's just their ignorance and stupidity and they hope against hope. But the reality is they are realists and they understand that the city does hold out possibilities, and the permeability of the membranes, which is another way of talking about the mobility of the city, the fact that in a multicultural society, when you come to the city, you define who you will be, you are not defined who you were and where you came from. In that sense, and that goes back to the beginning of time, young people coming to cities. In the Middle Ages, the mayor mentioned it this morning, people come to the cities in the sense that there they will acquire the means of freedom. And the means of freedom, to be free, means to have the means to move from where you were to where you want to be.
I have one last question for you, and then I hopefully have a chance for audience members and to get in with a question for Ben, who's just fabulous. My question for you is about your vision for the future. And we've all heard about the League of Nations and the United Nations and what that became as a way to bring together heads of state. But you, in your book, have an incredible idea. The idea of a League of Cities, or what you call an audiment for mayors. And I'd just like you to talk about how that, you kind of alluded at it, that governance mechanism for allowing mayors to cooperate and build bigger structures. But I'd like you to tell us about how you see that potentially, how we could build that. Because I think it's critical. We're going to be critical to build institutions, and this is a start, but how do we build forward in the future to create that kind of organizational infrastructure?
Well, Richard, there are two things. One is that we're already halfway there. The original subtitle for my book was If Mayors Ruled the World, Why They Should, and How They Already Do. Because the reality is that in the dozens and dozens of inner city associations, and I'm not just talking about the Mexican Conference of Mayors and the US Conference of Mayors and Euro cities in Europe, but I'm talking about CityNet and City Protocol and ICLE and the C40, and the most important international organization most people have never heard of, United Cities and Local Governments, which is an organization of about 3,000 or 4,000 cities that meets annually with mayors all over the world. So we already have an extraordinary, burgeoning, international, cross-border urban infrastructure in which cities are cooperating, talking to one another. We've heard today in the many sessions about all the different efforts around design, around planning, around environment, where cities are working together. But what's missing, I believe, and I'm a political scientist, is a governing capstone. You know, if you build an arch, you build a global arch of cities to deal with things in inner city organizations, that arch falls down until you drop the capstone in the top, and that makes it solid. The capstone, I believe, is a missing institution, which is a kind of network of networks, a global parliament of cities, call it. Consensual, bottom-up, opt-in, not mandates, not fiats, not ukase giving decrees and telling people what to do, but cities from every tranche, cities between 500 and 1,000 and 2 million, cities from 2 million to 10 million, and megacities from 10 to 30 million, meeting regularly, perhaps 3 times a year, to work together at exploring best practices, sharing those practices, suggesting what cities can do. Just one example, in the area of environment, 80% of our carbon emissions come from cities. It was said just a few minutes ago that New York City alone has 0.5% of the world's carbon emissions. If cities emit those greenhouse gases, that means they can deal with them, and they are. In the 5 or 6 years since they've been doing nothing, since Copenhagen, nation states, except saying why their sovereignty said they can't do things, cities like Los Angeles in greening the port, cities like New York, and the mayor talked about the insulation of buildings and just painting roofs white, cities like Bogota with above-ground fast transportation systems with dedicated bus lanes that other cars can't go in, have made major impact on carbon emissions. If cities were to do that collectively, if cities, whether or not China or the United States did anything, if Beijing and Beijing and Shanghai and Los Angeles and New York and Rio and Paris and London were to take measures that they're capable of taking against carbon emissions, we could do more than solve half to 3/4 of the world's carbon problems. And instead of preparing for the next Sandy and the next disaster, prepare for a world in which the ocean stopped rising.
Great. Is there a question or two in the audience? Anybody? Please, I see the microphone right behind you.
Hi, Peter Madden, Future Cities Catapult. I love the vision. I just had a question about competition between cities, because lots of city leaders I engage with think of it as a zero-sum game, and they're competing with other cities in their country for resources and globally for a limited number of places for their size of city on the global stage. So are you just wishing that competition away?
Not at all. It's funny, when we talk about markets in capitalism, competition is supposed to be a good thing. When we talk about cities, somehow it's supposed to be a bad thing. It's a little like saying, Stravinsky and Beethoven, are they in competition? Gee, one of them is going to steal all the musical lovers from the other. I mean, the creativity of cities, what cities do, cities are homes to billions of people. And as some flourish, they all flourish. I remember years ago, I'm a born New Yorker, by the way, and when 46th Street started developing as Restaurant Row, in the first days, and the same happened with West 42nd Street and Off-Broadway Theater, people said, wait a minute, there's already 2 restaurants on Restaurant Row. You're going to put a third and a fourth? That's going to be terrible. They're going to compete with one another. Of course, we know that Restaurant Row became a place where people go because of the restaurants. Same thing with West 42nd Street. As cities flourish one by one, they all flourish together. The competition is not a zero-sum game. And one of the great things about cities is they are not territorial. They are not territorial. They're not some land for me, less land for you. My walls about your walls. Cities are centers of networks. They are both nodes and synapses. They relate, if you like, digitally. They relate in trade. They relate in culture and ideas, but they don't crash against one another. They don't expand into one another's territory. Germany and Russia may impinge on Poland, but Paris and Berlin and Moscow don't impinge on Warsaw. They can all flourish well.
1 or 2 more questions from the audience? We have a hand here. I'm looking over on this side to make sure. One more.
I'm Neil Pierce, a journalist. Question is, the Parliament of Mayors and the role that could play, what impact would that have on the existing nation states of the world?
The Parliament of Mayors, the League of Mayors, the Audimat, what would that have, role would that have on the nation states?
Well, I hope it wouldn't infringe on the extraordinary success the United Nations has had in world peace and stopping genocide and so on. But the reality is that the success of cities is in part the story of the failure of nations and the failure of international organizations. Ideally, they can work hand in hand. Ideally, there's no reason why United Nations can't do effective things and cities can't also do effective things. But the dysfunction of nations and the dysfunction of the international associations made up of nations, whether it's the International Monetary Fund or the United Nations, is such that the world cries out, and the people of the world, a majority of whom live in cities, 78% in the Western world, cry out for solutions that states and international organizations are not bringing them. And the fact is, people want those solutions. They see in cities political officials who are pragmatists. We didn't talk about mayors, but mayors are pragmatists. The mayor said it this morning. Mayor Bloomberg, you might say, is he a Republican or a Democrat? Well, he was a Democrat, then he was a Republican, then he was an independent, and finally said it doesn't really matter. Boris Johnson of London calls himself an anarcho-Tory, and he really is. You know, he's at both ends of the spectrum. Politics of that kind, rigid ideology doesn't matter. Mayors get things done, and when they do it together, they can do it globally. Let me just tell you a quick little story from Mayor Kolek of Jerusalem, Ted Kolek, who was the great mayor of Jerusalem in the 70s and 80s. He always was having religious leaders from Jerusalem come to him and argue about access to the holy places and so on. And there was a time in the 1980s when there were imam and there were rabbis and there were Christian prelates in there screaming at him, access, we get, no, they have too much, we need more. And he finally said, gentlemen, spare me your sermons and I will fix your sewers. And that's typical of what mayors are able to do. Mayor Nutter, who I think is here today, said a long time ago, we would never get away with in cities like Philadelphia what they get away with in Washington. They can close down government sort of there, but imagine closing down New York so the subways don't work, the schools don't work, the hospitals don't work, the harbor doesn't work. Life would come to a standstill. This is where the rubber hits the road. Mayors have to solve their problems, and when they do it together across borders, they can begin, I think, to make a difference. And the book talks about areas like immigration, national security, areas that you think are unlikely for cities to be successful in, where they're doing it. Mayor Bloomberg and Ray Kelly sent the New York Intel Squad after a year or so in Washington following 9/11. He pulled them back and he sent them overseas, one by one, to global cities like Frankfurt, Jakarta, Rio, the places where they could get intel from other cities. And one of the reasons New York has been relatively safe over these years is that our intel is intercity, city to city. It no longer goes directly just through Washington. So cities can do globally what states are not doing, and they are.
Here is the book, hot off the press. I'm getting the wrap sign. If mayors rule the world, dysfunctional nations, rising cities. I just want to echo a couple things Ben said. We need an international organization of mayors. You have a meeting on that tomorrow?
Yeah, let me just say very quickly. I know we're out of time. Upstairs on the 4th floor at 2:15, following the final session here, there is a kind of rump session that Jim Anderson was kind enough to allow us to add on here, in which we will talk about the project for a global mayor's parliament. There'll be a number of mayors there. We had a meeting in Seoul. There'll be a meeting next year in Europe. This will be the second meeting, 2:15, 4th floor.
The folks for not only Atlantic, Aspen, consulting firms, McKinsey's were here. We talked a lot. We need comparable data. We still do not have comparable data from the World Bank, from the IMS. We can't compare global city to global city if we're going to put this on the agenda. We have to build in infrastructure, and that's what you're doing for making sure mayors and policymakers all across the world have the supports. If we're going to spend trillions of dollars building cities, and what you're doing is so supportive. Thank you, Ben, and I know we have my colleague Elizabeth Keffer with some final remarks.